expect to be listed in Matthew's genealogy, but they're not. They're completely missing. We have Tamar, who we looked at last week. We have our woman for this morning, Rahab. We've got the wife of Uriah, who's not even named. We know her as Bathsheba. We have Ruth, who Doug will work with you guys through next week. And then we have Mary. And what's interesting is that I pointed this out last week. The first 4 women in the genealogy all have something in common. They're all Gentiles. Tamar and today's woman Rahab are both Canaanites. Ruth is a Moabite, as hopefully Doug will explain next week. And Bathsheba was married to a Hittite, probably a Hittite herself. These were 4 women in Jesus' genealogy, and who's missing? All of those who are born Israelites. It's the 4 Gentiles in Jesus' family. And I make note of this just because, highlighting this very clearly, Matthew is showing us there is hope for the Gentile people in Jesus. We're all Gentiles. I don't think any of us are nationally born Hebrews that I know of. But regardless, we're all pagan at one point, as I mentioned last week. All of us have a hope in Christ. This morning we're going to look at Rahab and the story in Joshua 2 a little bit. It's a little cleaner than last week. There was some joking this week with me. How many times are you going to say these words? Are you going to talk about prostitutes or harlots or sex again? We got to keep this PG, Pastor Jeff. I just preach what the Bible says. So this morning's story is a little cleaner. We still have some sin. We still have some challenge. We still got some dysfunction. We still have a harlot. That's a prostitute. And so we need to think about these ladies, and specifically we need to think about Rahab this morning. And we're studying this series for 2 reasons. One, as you can see, all of these sermons hopefully will be entitled, There's a Seeker in the Text. Somebody, specifically the woman, is seeking something. This morning, Rahab is seeking safety. She's seeking protection. But why else are we studying these 5 ladies? Because we can identify with them very, very closely. Last week, we could identify very clearly with Tamar. She wanted justice. And we've all experienced that reality in our lives. We all want justice at some point. This morning, we're going to think about Rahab and the fact that she wants protection. She wants safety in an unsafe situation. And hopefully by the end of our sermon this morning, you realize you can identify with Rahab. There are moments in our lives that we seek safety. We seek protection. We seek security. And hopefully Rahab points us to Christ. But if you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to open. We're going to spend most of our time looking at Joshua 2. So we want to do what we did last week and just think about the story, kind of do an overview of the story. We're not going to dig in too deep, but just kind of get a frame, so to speak, for our character, for our woman Rahab. So the story begins in verse 1 with Joshua and the son of Nun, the 2 spies, and in fact all of the children of Israel camping right across the Jordan River from Jericho. So you've got a big river, think of the Schuylkill River right out here. It's separating all the children of Israel from the town of Jericho. And if you're familiar with the storyline, God's people have gotten out of Egypt. They made it through the Red Sea, as this story references. They made it to Sinai. They got the 10 Commandments and all the rest of the laws. They built the tabernacle. Then they spent 40 years wandering through the desert. Now they're sitting on the edge of the Promised Land, ready to go in. But Joshua wants to send in spies first, as verse 1 makes. 2 spies are sent secretly into Jericho, kind of investigate it. Kind of like, okay, what are these people like? What are these people saying? What is the situation? What is the reality of the town of Jericho? Think of Spygate if you're a football fan, like Bill Belichick, wanting to know what the other team is doing so he can be ready to beat the Eagles in the Super Bowl. It didn't work this year. But that kind of situation. They want to know what's going on and what's the lay of the land before they conquer the Promised Land. So that's how our story begins. And right away, in verse 1, we have the character we want to think about, Rahab. The ESV says, they came to a house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab. Maybe your translation says, and they came to the house of Rahab the harlot. That's who we're thinking about. And what's interesting is, if you take this thought for a moment, you realize this would be the last place these guys would want to go. a prostitute. We wouldn't want to be identified with a harlot. We wouldn't want to go to her house. It's where they would least expect to find us. So in reality, it's where the spies actually want to go. Like, where wouldn't the spies want to go to find refuge? The king's palace, maybe the guardhouse, maybe an official in the town. Let's go. No, we want to go somewhere and hide and seek refuge where we're going to be least expected it. And if you're a person in Jericho and you see two strange men walk into a house of a harlot, automatically you're assuming what? Well, I know why they're going in there. I know what their business is about. We don't have to worry about those guys. They've got something else on their mind besides investigating our town. And I was thinking about this story this week, and I'm thinking, why did these guys go to Rahab? Because it was a divine appointment. I had breakfast this week with Doug, and it was such an encouraging. And Doug reminded me, every relationship we have, every conversation we're a part of, God has set up in advance. God already knows the conversations that are going to happen around that donut table later. God knows who you're going to talk to tomorrow morning when you roll into work for the first moment. God knows who you're going to see next weekend. He set it all in advance. And God knew in the story, his woman Rahab needed these spies. And these spies needed his woman, Rahab. God's providence orchestrated this out perfectly. And we'll see why in a moment. But I think it was just a good reminder as we think about this story. This meeting wasn't by chance. These spies didn't go, well, let's just throw a dart against the wall and see where it lands. We'll go to that house. God's hand was orchestrating behind the scenes perfectly. My two spies are going to go to Rahab, and they're going to have a conversation, and they're going to find protection, and she's going to find protection, and I've got all this set up in advance. Flip over to Hebrews chapter 11 quickly. Hebrews 11, just verse 31. It's a New Testament mentioning of Rahab, and I want us to see it just because we need to understand something going into this story. Hebrews 11, verse 31. The writer of Hebrews says in 31, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. As we'll see in a moment in verse 2 and 3, right? The spies saw. The spies got found out. The king of Jericho knows where they're at. And he sends his guards to Rahab and says, hand over these spies. Rahab lies. We'll get to the lie in a moment. But I think it's important for us to realize, and that's why I went to Hebrews 11:31. Rahab already has a faith in this story before the spies even show up. God has been working in her life. He's been giving her this news of what he's doing with the people of Israel. And by faith, when these spies come to Rahab's door, she opens her door and kindly takes them in. She welcomes the spies. She gives them refuge because she has a faith in God. If you don't believe me, look at verse number 9. Verse 9 of our story. Rahab's talking, and she's saying to the spies, I know that the Lord has given you this land. That's a pretty bold statement. A woman of faith can declare, I know the Lord has given you this land. So what does she do? She gives the spies refuge. She sends the guards on a wild goose chase. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they were doing. Go get them. They just left the town. When really, the spies were hiding on her roof. But she sends the spies on a wild goose chase. And I want to pause for a moment and focus on the fact that she lies. The ends never justify the means. It's never, we're going to do wrong in order to accomplish good. A sin is a sin, and every single sin we commit is cosmic treason in the eyes of God. Every sin, any sin, all sin is never okay. God never says, oh, good job, Rahab, thanks for lying, you solved the problem I couldn't figure out. No, her lie is not justified. We'll get to the why she lied, and we'll get to think about that lie in a moment. But I just want us to realize, we can't look at Rahab and go, well, if Rahab lied and it worked out, so if I just lie in this situation, it'll all work out for me too. It doesn't work that way. We should never lie. So Cameron, don't lie to your mom. It's not going to work out. It's still a sin. Don't use Rahab as an example. But she's got faith, and that's what verse 9 shows us. I know that the Lord has given you this land. And then she says, at the end of verse 11, for your Lord, for your God, is a God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Talk about a profession of faith. I did a quick survey this week. This is the first profession of faith in the Bible. Someone the first time going, I know that your God is going to be victorious, and I know your God is the God above all. And that's what Rahab is saying. In the beginning of 9, in her profession, and at the end of 11, in the closing of her profession. But look how she compares her faith to the people of Jericho. Verse 9, right? I know the Lord has given you this land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites across the Jordan. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. She has faith. Everybody else in Jericho has fear. Talk about their hearts melting. Just picture that. What are we scared of? I'm scared of shots, man. I hate needles. Every time a needle comes in a room, like if I go to the doctor, my knees are shaking. I don't like shots. I don't know why. It's just a fear I have. Maybe your fear is spiders. And you see a spider in the room and your heart melts and you run away. I joke about fear because we don't think of it in the terms of our hearts melting. But if you were to describe your heart melting, that's serious fear. That's biting your nails, that's covering your eyes, that's scared to death. And that's what Jericho is, because they've heard about what God has done to his people. He took his people right out of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. They crossed the Red Sea. They took care of the kings across the Jordan River. And the people of Jericho are scared. Compare that to Rahab, who has faith. She says, I know the Lord has given you this land. We could say it this way. She's declaring, I know your God has the victory. And then she finishes it with, your God is a God above all. He's the God over all. She has faith. So what does her faith do? The third part of the story, beginning in verse 15, is all about a covenant. Sorry, back up to verse 12. After she makes a profession, she says, now then, to the 2 spies, please swear to me. Please take an oath with me. Because I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with me and my family. That word kindly there in the ESV comes from the Hebrew word hesed. Covenant kindness, covenant love. She's going to the spies and saying, I've taken you guys in. I've protected you. I've given you refuge. Now respond by giving me an oath. Make a covenant with me. But why is she making a covenant? Because as verse 13 says, that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to me, and deliver our lives from death. She is seeking protection. She doesn't want to die with the rest of the Jericho people. She doesn't want to die in the conquest of the promised land. She's seeking protection. She wants to be saved from death, and she wants the rest of her family to be saved with her. So she goes to the 2 spies who are God's children, and she says, make a covenant with me. Just promise me you will have your God protect me in this conquest. The spies agree. I love the spies' response. You staked your life on our life, so we'll stake our lives on your life. You risked your life for us, Rahab, so we're going to risk our lives now for you. We will make this covenant with you. So their instructions. When we're going to conquest the land, hang the scarlet cord out your window. Verse 15, then she let down a rope through her window. That's how the spies were going to escape. But the spies tell her, when we're going to come to conquest, Rahab, hang this scarlet rope out your window. And when I was studying this week, I paused and I said, why would they tell her to hang her scarlet rope? And I think it's important that it's stressed scarlet twice. Why would they have this hang this red rope out the window? Because when the spies knew they were going to come and take over Jericho, they needed to know which house was Rahab's. How are they going to identify whose is Rahab's house and whose is not? Well, let me just guess. I think it's the third house on the left around the corner to the back. I think that was Rahab's house. No, the spies said, we need to somehow get Rahab to identify she's with us. So hang that rope out your window. That's how the spies identified who Rahab was. Well, as the story finishes, she keeps the spies safe. The spies stake their life on her. She makes a promise, a covenant with them. They covenant with her. She lets them down the rope. The spies escape. And I just want to highlight verse 24. The spies tell Joshua, truly the Lord has given us all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away in fear because of us. The spies tell Joshua, God has gone before us. The victory is ours. It's a story I remember as a kid. I remember this story as a kid. I could still see the flannel graph my Sunday school teacher used to tell it, the little wall with the little red rope hanging. And I always thought, man, that'd be cool to be one of those spies. It'd be cool to be one of those spies in the story and sneak around town and hide out and hide yourself on a roof and then climb down a wall and go live in a cave for 3 days. And I always identified myself as a kid growing up with one of the spies, as one of God's people. And this week, as I was studying this text, I realized we should identify with Rahab in this story. And let me show you how. There's 3 ways we need to identify with Rahab in this story this morning. First, Rahab, right away in verse 1, is identified as a prostitute. The King James, I believe, says Rahab the harlot. In the Hebrew, it's Rahab's name, and linked to it, right next to it, is the word prostitute or harlot. That's who she was. There was no separating the two. It was like you would say, Pastor Jeff, done. It's a linking to my name. Pastor and Jeff linked together. It's how you identify me. Maybe you don't. It's fine. Maybe you're a roofer like I was at one point. And you would identify what you did with what your name is. And you would say, well, how do I differentiate between that Jeff and this Jeff? Well, that Jeff is a school teacher and this Jeff is the roofer. You use things to identify yourself. In this text, it's Rahab the harlot. So let's jump into her world for a minute. She goes down to the market and she wants to buy produce at the local market stand. Guess what the market stand's going to ask her? So what does the harlot want today to eat? Well, maybe she's gone down to the city gate and she's just relaxing at the city gate, taking in sun, watching her kids play out in the open field. And someone comes into town and all of a sudden someone goes, well, you need to avoid her. She's a harlot. Well, maybe she has gone across town and is visiting her friend, her harlot friend, and someone sees her walk by. Well, there goes Rahab the harlot. You get the sense here? It's identification. That's who she was. What she did, this sin, trailed her entire life. And then you have this story. Right in the middle of the story, she has faith in God, and yet when the opportunity comes, what does she do? She makes up a lie. She lies. She still has faith. Hebrews 11's clear. She's got faith even before the spies come. And yet, in the moment of faith, in the moment her faith could shine the brightest, she takes matters into her own hand and lies. I don't know if I can trust God to really solve this. I'll just lie and solve the problem myself. I find this comforting because God uses a sinner to accomplish His purposes. Maybe your sin has trailed you for years. You just can't escape that one thing you did 5 years ago. Maybe you're like me, and when your faith needs to shine the brightest, you wilt and you sin as a result. We could all take courage and hope. God used a lying harlot to accomplish His will. That means God can use any of us to accomplish whatever He wants. That's encouraging to me. That should be encouraging to us. God uses flawed, broken, weak sinners like us to accomplish His will. That's the first reason I think we can identify with Rahab in this story. We are just like her. Number 2. So Rahab, in faith, sees the 2 spies at her door. She has a choice. She thinks, well, okay, if I take these men in and they find out, I could die. They could kill me as a Benedict Arnold. If you don't know who Benedict Arnold is, go ask Jeff. He'll bring you all up to speed on the history of who Benedict Arnold is. She thinks, well, maybe if I take these spies in, my family will get taken prisoner and I'll lose all of my family. She's pretty concerned about her family in the story. She's got a choice to make when the spies are standing at her door. She can either have faith in God, this God that she's heard about, this God that she knows is identifying with these 2 spies, and risk her life, or she can say, I can't risk this. I'm not going to risk this at all. I'm just going to shut the door, the spies go find somewhere else. Her faith leads her to take a risk. She didn't know what would happen when she took that next step. Maybe you can identify what movie this is from that picture. Sean can. What movie is this from, Sean? Right, he's standing there on the edge of this big chasm. And he just sees this huge hole and he's got to have faith that next step is there. He has to take a risk. Rahab had to take a risk. Our lives as Christians is all about taking risks, or the opportunity to do so. Maybe it's that next conversation when you're standing across from somebody and they go, I heard you go to church. I heard you talk about Jesus sometimes. You're presented with a risk. Do I say yes and identify? Or do I say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know who you're talking about. And you don't take the risk. Maybe you're watching your neighbor hang up Christmas lights this afternoon. And you have the opportunity to go over there and say, hey, our church is having a Christmas Eve service. Do you want to come? That's an opportunity for a risk. We are all risk takers in our lives at one point or another. That's what God does with our faith. He tests it. He stretches it. He presents us with opportunities right at our doors sometimes. Conversations that are divine appointments. And says, are you going to take a risk or are you not going to take a risk? So that asks us about our faith. Are we risk takers in our faith? Only you can answer that question. Only you can take that next step that you're not sure what's exactly there. So that's the second way I think we can identify with Rahab, being a risk taker. Number 3, though, ultimately I'm going to this story this morning. We're looking at Rahab in the genealogy because she's seeking protection from God. She's heard about what God did with His people. He took them out of Egypt. They went across the Jordan River. They dried up that ground. They walked through the desert for 40 years. They took out the kings across the river, our enemies. And she realizes they're going to take over Jericho. Jericho's done. It's finished. God's already won this war. As she said in her profession in verse 6, I know the Lord has given you this land. And she wants to survive God's judgment. She wants to survive this conquest. So the only place she can turn, she does. God through His 2 spies. Make a covenant with me. Protect me. Keep me safe. Don't let me die, as verse 13 says. Rahab, in faith, turns to God in the moment of danger. And this is an important point for us. Just turn on the TV. We live in a world where violence is on the TV every day. Maybe you're old school. Maybe you like to read the newspaper. Flip open the newspaper this afternoon. Right there in the newspaper, I guarantee you're going to see some terrorist attack somewhere in the world took place sometime in the last 24 hours. Maybe you're new school and you like Facebook. Just scroll down Facebook. You're going to see some action or somebody that did something or some house that got robbed. Like, we live in a world full of evil, full of violence. If you're like me, that's pretty scary. I don't know if I'm going to survive the drive home today. I hope to. But Alex could be driving 95 miles an hour recklessly on 422 and I might not make it home. That's a joke from last Sunday, if you didn't get it. Think about this, though. We're all supposed to be risk takers. We're all supposed to walk across the street and go to our neighbor who, when she's hanging Christmas lights, and invite her to Christmas Eve. We're all supposed to sit across from our relative that hates our faith on Thanksgiving and say, hey, I'd love to talk to you about Jesus again. We're all supposed to say yes in that moment of identification. I do go to church. I do love Jesus. Can I talk to you? Those moments are scary too. Those are the moments we really need protection. We really need safety. We really need to find security. That's where we can identify with Rahab the greatest. When our risk is right for God and we need to seek security. So, Rahab gives us the only solution. Last week we thought about, when we looked at Tamar and we thought about taking justice into our own hands, we realized we are not the solution. You could all say the same thing here. Pastor Jeff, I know I'm not the solution. I know I can't protect myself. Well, I know I can protect myself. So, for example, here's some fatherly advice to all the kids in the room. Don't stick your finger into a socket. That will electrocute you. That's how you protect yourself. Alex, don't drive across the Schuylkill when it looks like it's covered in ice. It's not, you're going to sink in the water. Right? Don't come to my house next 2 weeks when I have my fire and jump into my fireplace. That's not Jeff, I see you smiling. Don't get any ideas. We're not talking about this kind of protection. We're talking about the unknown. When you don't know what that next step of risk will take. You're not omniscient. You don't know it all. Sorry to tell you, Ben. I know you probably think you do. You're in that stage in life. I remember it. We don't know it all. We're not omnipotent. We're not all powerful. So we know we're not the solution. And we know who is the solution. Flip over to Isaiah chapter 41. Our second verse for this morning. Isaiah chapter 41. Actually, sorry, I was last in 8. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11. This is it comes right in the middle of a servant song where Isaiah is talking about this servant of God, the servant of Yahweh that's going to come someday. And the he is referencing is the servant that God will send someday to his people. And he says in Isaiah 40, verse 11, he, being the servant, will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. Maybe your translation reads, he will protect his sheep like a shepherd. I was reminded this week, Becky and I have friends who are missionaries in China to the underground church. China doesn't know they're in the country as missionaries. But they went to China to be missionaries to the underground church to support and train pastors. And in his prayer letter this week, he was talking about just protection and how China has stirred up some of their fight against these Christian missionaries. And he had this statement, and he said, there are moments where I know I can only turn to God for the protection I need. Becky and I also have friends who are foster parents. They just foster kids. And talk about taking in an unknown situation and trusting God with the results. We all seek protection in our lives. We all seek security in our lives. We all want safety. I had an opportunity this week to go visit Roland, and just praying with him and sitting across from him in the hospital room, I was reminded, he probably once protected by God. Get me out of here, get me healthy, get me home with my family. Maybe it's sitting across from your checkbook. Lord, I don't know how I'm going to pay all my bills this month. I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet. I need you to provide and protect my family. Maybe it's when you know your boss hates the fact you're a Christian. And if he hears you talk about Jesus, you're going to be on the outs. And you need protection in those moments when you're taking risks. Maybe you're like me. Maybe you've got kids that are getting older that you just can't control anymore. God, I need you to protect my kids. I can't do it all. Maybe it's the job you work for. Maybe it's downsizing. Maybe it's going belly up, and you know you might not have a job in 2019. God, I need you to protect me into the future. I don't know what tomorrow holds. Maybe you're like me, and it was yesterday when I was watching my neighbor across the street hang her Christmas lights, and I failed because I didn't trust God's protection to go invite her to Christmas Eve service. We all seek it in our lives. We all know the only solution. And I love this verse in Isaiah because it has that image. That's Jesus with every single one of his sheep. Rahab got it. She understood it. She didn't know it. She didn't identify it. She couldn't quote this verse. She couldn't say clearly, I know God is going to protect me. But she knew when she needed it the most where she could turn. And here's the truth and I love this image. Whatever happens to that sheep, in that position, the shepherd controls. Nothing is going to happen to that sheep without the shepherd allowing it, without the shepherd ordaining it to happen, without the shepherd going, yes, my sheep does need a shot today. Give him that needle right in the arm. And the shepherd is holding the sheep the whole time it happens. Talk about a story that points us to the real meaning of Christmas. We celebrate Christ. We think about hope in this time of year, as Sean and Josh and Jaden read. In every and all circumstances, when there is the only hope we have, it's because we are that sheep, as Isaiah 40:11 says, in our shepherd's arms. Rahab, we can identify with her. We're sinners. We're still being used by God. Risk is right for God, but we all know where to turn because we are that sheep. And I want to close with the clearest place we can see the protection of Christ. I said earlier in the sermon, Rahab knew that God was going to conquest, he was going to destroy Jericho. Jericho was hopeless. They were done in. God and his people, they were going to come wipe them all out. And she wanted protection. She wanted to make it through and endure the judgment of God on the Jericho people. She wanted to be like Noah in the ark. She wanted to survive the flood. She wanted to endure and be protected all through God's wrath. Jesus Christ went to the cross to protect and secure for each and every one of us safety in the wrath of God. Christmas is a time we think about Mary and Joseph and the angels, and those are all good things. They all point us to the baby born in the manger. But Christmas is also a time to think about the cross. And on the cross of Christ, he protected each of us who are in him from God's wrath. He secured us. He took us through it. And he gave us the only safety that we could find. So if we're going to think about Christ and be thankful and respond to his protection, what better place to look than the cross of Jesus Christ? I hope and pray as we celebrate Christmas together in the month ahead, as we have times of fellowship, as we have times with family, as we have times of worship, We don't lose sight of the cross. The manger was step one. The cross was the climax. Let us not forget that it was on the cross of Christ that he protected each and every one of us. Let's pray. Father, I thank you again for the opportunity we can open your word. I thank you for Rahab. I thank you for her life. I thank you most importantly for her faith. And I thank you how she directs us to Jesus Christ. God, I ask that we would have a heart like Rahab, that we would have eyes to see who you are and what you're doing, that we would have faith as strong as Rahab, to take risks and to take that step into the unknown for your glory. Lord, and I pray that we would respond like Rahab and turn to you and you alone for the only protection and safety that we can find. God, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for sending him to this world to be our one and true safety. Help us to turn to him in faith, go to him, and respond to you for your glory. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.